Greetings, CultureCast viewers, and thank you for joining us for another episode where we're going to take some time today to explore another part of this wonderful world. I'm very lucky that one of my peers and colleagues has graciously accepted my invitation to join us today, Steve Brady. Steve is the 4-H educator in Warren County, and Steve and I spent some time together traveling, of course. Him and I attended the Global 4-H Summit. It was the first one that had happened, and it was up in Canada in Ottawa, and we roomed together and had the opportunity to get to know Steve and his amazing story, both personally and the amazing things that he's doing with the 4-H program, to introduce some of our youth to brand new cultures. So Steve, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. And let's kick things off by telling the viewers a little bit about yourself and your family.
All right, great. Well, I am very happy to be with everybody virtually. This is one of the few times that I'm able to do this, so I think it's a great opportunity to kind of spread the word a little bit about what's happening in Ohio 4-H. I am originally from North Carolina, even though my accent may not be as strong as it used to be once, but I'm from North Carolina. My wife is from Germany, and we have two girls, 11 and 13, who are both bilingual, and we have a opportunity to travel there back to Germany usually about once a year, and that's provided my kids growing up in kind of that environment, as well as me having a chance to explore the culture in Germany as well. I'm have a natural affinity for travel anyway, and just kind of exploring cultures and being just generally interested in people and just how they work and how they operate in their own cultures. So that's part of what I came into the job with Extension with. Have been here for 18 years now, and have really enjoyed kind of expanding what we're going to talk about today, which is these immersion programs.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Warren County is in southwestern Ohio, just north of Cincinnati. And Steve, we could spend multiple episodes talking about all your travels, but would you take just a couple seconds to tell our viewers some of the different countries that you've been to?
Sure. Well, my wife and I have a competitive streak going with how many countries we've visited. And of course, we've been together, so we're visiting multiple countries together. But at last count, we were both at 27 countries at this point. We did a lot of travel before we were married, but since then, we've kind of elevated that level. We just got back from Mexico, a Mexico trip to visit one of her childhood friends in central Mexico. We were in Croatia last summer, visiting friends in kind of southern Germany, that Austria-Croatia region. So we love to take the opportunity and advantage of being able to travel and see friends all over the world. So that definitely is great.
And Steve, what was the first country that you visited?
First country was Northern Ireland. It was with a learning tour through a church that I was involved with when I was in my 20s, and we were exploring kind of the violence and how that affected culture in Northern Ireland with the Protestants and Catholics.
And what about that trip, I guess, gave you the bug, so they say, to want to continue to visit 26 other countries?
It was just the opportunity to see something new. Growing up in a real small town in North Carolina, I didn't get a chance to really to visit a whole lot of other places around or outside of my own kind of home area. My parents still are somewhat kind of homebodies, and so they like to stay around, which is great. And I just had this kind of itch to see more of the world. And that first trip to Northern Ireland really opened my eyes to how many other places and people and experiences there were to have around the world.
Thank you for sharing that. We're going to talk about two programs today that Steve leads through the 4-H program. One of them is, well, they're both really cultural immersion trips. One is domestic here within the U.S., and another is still technically U.S., but a little bit of a longer plane ride. So Steve, let's jump into the urban immersion program that you lead. And we have some photos that will accompany Steve telling us about this. So first of all, tell us, where did you get the idea to take youth from Ohio to Washington, D.C., and not just to see monuments, but to really engage with the people and the culture there?
Yeah, well, it really started after college. I joined a volunteer service, and we had it was a year-long volunteer experience, and we were sent to kind of to a place where we did an orientation for about 3 weeks. And in that 3 weeks, we were constantly kind of put in these simulation kind of experiences to kind of get us ready for the year. I ended up working in a homeless shelter in California for a year, and found that really the whole 4-H motto applied, that learn by doing. So immersing yourself in a situation, that's the best way to really grasp what you're learning. So I wanted to, when I started this position here, I wanted to bring really that philosophy of diving into things. If you want to learn about a culture or a place, that's the best way to do it. And, you know, this is kind of the way I sum up. So if the viewer, if you can cross your arms like this, normally you cross your arms like this most every time without really thinking about it. It just happens. But if you look down and see which arm is on top, and then you flip the arm that goes on top, you'll notice kind of automatically that it feels a little different, and it's not automatic. And so for me, it's about getting youth thinking a different way about certain places, about themselves, about their place in their communities, and really in the world. And so taking these trips, both in the States and out and somewhat outside, is a way to kind of really put youth into that situation where they're having to figure things out anew and learn a new way.
Tell us about the urban immersion trip. We have the program description up there on the screen.
Yeah.
Maybe supplement that a little bit with, who are you recruiting to this and why should they participate?
Yeah, well, I'm looking for teens, high school age teens, throughout the state of Ohio, and it's exciting. We're actually been partnering with Kentucky over the last couple of years, and they bring youth as well. And it's really, to me, about blending youth from different areas around Ohio coming together and then going on this experience. So we have youth from rural settings, we have youth from suburban, and youth from urban settings who are coming together and having this new experience for all of them. It really is about this experiential learning and about diving into the city. We actually live inside of Washington, D.C. at a basement of a church that's more set up like a dorm, and we operate from that setting. But it really gives youth a chance to see, okay, what is it like to live inside the city limits of DC? Many trips that we take, either whether the 4-H center is outside of DC and it's a little more removed, this experience really puts youth right in the center of the city.
Go to the next photo. And
yeah, these are trips.
Showing some of the groups.
Yeah, these are the groups that I've taken over the last, I guess, 5 years now, and it just shows you kind of a mix of the youth. The first year I did this. I don't know which year that says 2014 or 15. It was all female teens that I took, and of course a female advisor along with me, and then that's evolved over the years to include, again, Ohio and Kentucky, and then youth from all over the state. So it gives 4-Hers a chance not only just to get to know DC, but also get to know other 4-Hers in different states and different programs, where they can really start to build these friendships. And these have lasted quite a number of years, from what I understand from other people.
How long is the trip?
The trip's 4 days. We leave early Thursday morning. In order to beat the traffic, we drive through, and we get there Thursday afternoon, and we start right away.
Let's go to the next slide, and Steve's got some photos of the programming piece of it. So talk a little bit about what the youth are doing, Steve.
Well, it's not just a sightseeing trip. That needs to be clear from the very start before youth, sign up. We will see some monuments and things that, normally you would see on a DC trip if you were in school, but it's not centered around that. It's really centered around being a part of the community there in the city. We do service projects that involve both actively participating in serving food to people who are homeless or in the community who are in need. We also have a chance to work in different organizations that do projects with people in need as well. You can see here some pictures of the 4-Hers who are working in this, it's called Wider Space, which actually gives out furniture and household goods, clothing to people who need. And then there's one picture of people working in a soup kitchen, preparing the food. And then there's also a project that we do called Bread for the Journey, which we actually prepare food there in the place where we stay. And then we deliver those meals to people if they're interested on the streets of DC as we deliver through the city.
If I could just interject something for a minute, there's a common perception amongst individuals that have not been involved in 4-H that they are primarily just animal raisers and animal caretakers. And right. I think you really indicate just a wealth of different programs that the 4-H really gets involved with.
Yeah, and we're very fortunate here in Warren County. We still have the very same types of programs, which include the county fair and our 4-H club system and our camps. These are additional programs because we're blessed to have 2 4-H educators here in the county that I'm able to do these immersion trips. So you're right. This is really kind of going. It's still applying the learning by doing, which I think is very much at the core of 4-H, and it's also expanding kind of the reaches of what 4-H means for youth in our county and in our state.
Well, I know that Dustin, in his programs, prior programs, CultureCast, has demonstrated that it's just not in Ohio, but there are 4-H programs throughout the world that are community involved. Wouldn't you say, Dustin?
Yeah, absolutely, Patrick. And Steve's programs are a testament to that. And it's like he's saying, there's so much culture that we can learn from across our own state border, across right. county borders, even in our nation's capital. You don't need to travel overseas. And I think that's, we're breaking a little bit from what we've normally done on CultureCast, where we focus on one person who has been to one country somewhere else. And today we're highlighting that our own country is full of these different cultures, and that you don't have to spend thousands of dollars and get on a plane to go somewhere. Right. You can do that right here. So
yeah, and that's one of my intentions, is to really make these programs affordable. The DC trip itself is only $170. To go on a 4-day experience. Almost unheard of in a lot of ways, but I want to make it accessible. And for me as an educator, it's really about planting seeds. I'm not expecting monumental, changes with the youth who go necessarily, but it is about planting seeds and giving people encouragement to think about the world in a different way, as well as just how their experience and how their perceptions really do shape what the reality is.
Steve, talking about those seeds, do you have a story that you could share of how youth have maybe struggled or interpreted some of these experiences, and especially one of the last ones you talked about, giving food to homeless people?
Yeah.
I just think, wow, that would be really uncomfortable for me. Do you see that in the youth?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about homelessness. That's really a key focus. One of the main reasons I lived in Washington, D.C. for a little over a year and worked with the National Coalition for the Homeless and was the Speakers Bureau educator for the coalition. So my job was to travel around and to audiences, both college and church groups and youth groups, and the speakers that I had were people who were homeless or formerly homeless, and I facilitated that discussion that happened between the two. And so for me, that's a passion. So I have the coalition speak every time that we go, so they get to hear from somebody who has experienced homelessness or who is currently homeless and get to ask questions. And part of the shift that happens is this stereotype that they call out and ask youth to share when during the presentation. They're pretty honest about wanting to hear what they actually think, and so they take and kind of remold what a stereotype is for a person who is homeless or experiencing homelessness to somebody who is just dirty and unkept and not clean, to really anybody can end up in the situation of homelessness. And so they really shift their mindset in thinking about that. And also not just being in the city, but they learn about rural homelessness, which is very much of an issue in rural places too. So they start to think about how is this operating where I'm from.
Let's go to the next photo with the food groups. So you mentioned earlier, Steve, that it's an experiential learning, so learning by doing, hands-on experience. And I love the way that you do this through the food activity. Tell the viewers about that.
Yeah, so one of our first activities when we get to Washington is to walk to the grocery store, which is about 12 blocks away. And they're in designated food groups, so 4 or 5 youth per group. And they shop at a local grocery store. And I'm giving them money based on the formulas that if we were all on food assistance, this would be your food budget. So it ends up that a group may have to cook 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, for roughly $35 to $37 for the whole group. So they immediately are kind of thrown into the situation like, okay, what are we going to buy? How are we going to provide for the whole group to have a meal with this limited resource? So they get creative and they work together as a team, and it ends up turning out really well. But at first there's a moment of panic about how are we going to do this. And so the goal is to put them in some sort of situation where they have to figure things out based on limited resources, which families have to struggle with that all the time, not only just this country, but all over the world.
And you've also told me about ethnic food nights that you do. So tell us about those.
Yeah. So we do on the last night, we do have an opportunity for the youth to sample foods from other places, and DC has a wealth of ethnic restaurants. We have gone to Ethiopian restaurants before, Indian, Thai, Mediterranean, Afghani, Vietnamese. So you name it, the kind of foods are there. And they have to pick something that they've never eaten before. So that's part of the requirement for doing that. So some of the youth are pleasantly surprised that they like the food that they never thought they would before. Others, it confirms that they don't like that type of food. But either way, they're getting the experience of trying something new and different.
And I can attest that what Steve's talking about it just permeates through his entire being, because him and I had a meeting one time. And he took me to this, it was a Japanese restaurant.
Korean, excuse me.
It was in the strip mall that I never would have gone to on my own. Steve made me order something that I had never had before, and it was fantastic.
Right.
It was funny when we walked in. The waitress actually knew who Steve was, and this was a restaurant in Columbus, and Steve lives near Cincinnati, so it's such a great way to connect with people. But and I'm thankful for that too. So the last thing I want to hit on with the urban immersion is you're doing this again. So if we have 4-H youth or parents or grandparents of 4-H youth who are watching, sign up.
I would love to, yeah, and I promote this, all over the state, and we'll have another trip this September. There are the dates there on the screen. $170 is what it costs. The application can be found on our homepage, which is warren.osu.edu. If you have questions, obviously you can get a hold of me. But we'd love to have, a good number of youth going this year to have this great experience. I'm looking for great things. We have a new partnership with the Latin American Youth Center. They're in DC, where we should have some joint projects together doing service in the city as well.
So let's transition to the other immersion trip that you lead. And that is a cultural immersion trip to Puerto Rico. So we'll put the slide up on the screen, and as that's happening, you had a kind of an interesting road to finally get to Puerto Rico. So tell the viewers about what happened.
Yeah, so I've taken this is the second trip, the one you're seeing here. The first trip was with youth back in 2015, and this last trip, which is just in 2018, was with 4-H educators from around the state. And we were intending on going in 2017, but if many of you remember, Hurricane Maria came through and just devastated the island, and so it wasn't possible for us to go, but we did reschedule for this past year. And we had, I think it was 12 of us who attended the trip. And the idea for this whole cultural immersion trip for 4-H educators was really to plant the seed in them that they then become charged with planning something for youth or for adults in their own home communities. So to go back as kind of a train the trainer, if you kind of think about that model, that they would begin to think about how they can spread this type of immersion experience to the youth or to the adults they work with.
On our next slide, it tells, there's an overview you put together of Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Help to dispel some common maybe misunderstandings about Puerto Rico's status and how it connects to the U.S.
It is a territory. I think many people, probably know that at least. It's not a very, very large island. You can definitely tell that you feel like you're in another country, even though you're technically in the U.S. Spanish is very widely spoken. Some people around the cities and the kind of tourist areas do speak English very well. When you get outside of that, it becomes very apparent that Spanish is the primary language, and that the Puerto Rican culture is very intact and really a prominent thing that you notice when you're there. I believe that many people may not know how hospitable Puerto Rico really is and how the people are so welcoming. That's some that the groups have talked about over and over again, about Puerto Rican culture. And one of the things that I try to do with the youth or adults who go is to get impressions of what they think they're going to experience in Puerto Rico before they go. And then kind of getting a same kind of question on the back end of what did they experience and how was that assumption or that prejudgment wrong, or was it right when they had. So it really just helps to expand their view of Puerto Rican culture. But the hospitality is probably one of the biggest things that people may not know really operates well with Puerto Rican culture.
A quick question, Steve. There's probably something or a few things that really dissuade or amaze the students when they would go over there, the 4-Hers. Care to share any, that they never knew before? Or
Yeah. Well, hospitality is a big one, but right behind that, I think that the would be a big one would be resilience. I mean, the Puerto Rican people have a tremendous kind of inner strength for being able to deal with whatever situation is in front of them. An example would be just in this past trip, we ate with we have a host meal where we eat with the family and talk about various things, about our lives. And they were sharing that they had not had power for 12 months after the hurricane. And they had just gotten power about a month before we actually even got there. And it wasn't a huge complaint or a large, rant over the U.S. government or about aid or things like that. They just dealt with it and they moved on. And so the youth were just amazed that you would be without power for that long and just not just go on and on about complaining and whining about not having it. They talked about what it would like to not have power for just a day, much less for 12 months. So the resilience of the people there and how they work together and just their spirit was something that the youth commented on over and over again.
And in those situations, I always think about what it would be like for Puerto Ricans to come here and to see what we do when it's projected that we're going to have 6 to 8 inches of snow the next day, and how people go and just wipe out grocery stores.
Right.
It's just fascinating to see their perspective on that.
Yeah, and pace of life is another big thing, and I don't know if we can keep showing pictures up as I talk, but pace of life is another big part of the change that youth experience. You can see we're eating there together. Meals become important, and one of the things I do for these trips is I really limit phone use and for technology so people can connect with each other. For educators, it was really about helping them to kind of redefine what it is that they do in their work back in Ohio and how they can expand their view of seeing new audiences in their own communities. and how they can work with people who are, maybe they didn't see before. So it really is about connection and about kind of community when we're up in these mountains, because we're about 3 hours away from San Juan in the settings that you see here. We're also in food groups, and we're working together and doing different activities together.
Tell us what a typical meal looks like in Puerto Rico.
Typical meal are your beans and rice, as well as some fresh vegetables. It's a little harder to get sometimes up in the mountains, and you have a lot of beans and rice. Probably the biggest thing, big staple of their diet. Tortillas as well, and some fruit. I mean, the guava, the papaya. Some of those are pretty plentiful.
And coconuts.
And coconuts. And there's me cracking up on a coconut in the picture there. And my wife, who lived in Mozambique for a while, had to tell me how to do that, because I did not know how to do that on my own. And so, yeah, it's a very different kind of food culture, but people tend to really like it.
Let's go to the next photo. And so, speaking of the hurricane, you guys did some.
We actually had a chance to do
right?
service. We did some service while we were there, and we work with a disaster relief effort there on the island, Brethren Disaster Relief, and we kind of plugged ourselves in and worked on painting some housing, and also doing some external painting for a pastor who had really focused all her efforts on working on other people's homes, but not her own. And so one of the efforts that we had decided to do was to actually work on her home, because her home had been severely damaged as well. So that was a really key moment for a lot of us while we were there, was to work with people in their rebuilding efforts.
The last two slides that I want to show just showcase some of the beauty. So tell us about some of the fun you have.
Yeah, well, Puerto Rico is an absolutely beautiful island, and it really has a lot to offer in terms of variety. You have peaks as high as 3,500 feet in the center part. Then, of course, you have the beaches and the rainforest. But one of the things that we needed to do while we were there was to experience some of that. And some of these were adventure hikes, is what I kind of adventure days, where people got to choose what they wanted to do. Kayaking and caving was one, zip lining was another, and then also just the hiking through the canyons were another. But all these were really an effort to really not only just give youth professionals a chance to kind of dive into immersion, but also just a way to kind of see the importance of their job and to be able to reflect on what they do in Ohio. So in some ways, I kind of a sabbatical of sorts, to be able to kind of refresh and rejuvenate for their work in Ohio, because 4-H educators work hard.
Absolutely. Sarah, if you go back to the previous photo, where were the building photos taken?
The building, this is in Old San Juan. So half the trip involved staying in the mountains up in Castañer, and in the kind of western mid part of the country. And then the other part took place in San Juan. So these are pictures from the San Juan area.
Well, Steve, thank you again for joining us at CultureCast. Last question I'd like to ask, briefly tell the folks, why should they visit Puerto Rico?
Well, you should visit Puerto Rico, one, because it's beautiful, but also it really gives you a chance to go out of the country but still be in the country. And you don't need a passport to go, and the people there will just warm your heart and you will fall in love.
You know, one of the things that I thoroughly enjoy about CultureCast is that every month makes me want to go to that particular country, and that's what's nice about the program. So Puerto Rico is on my to-do list now.
Yeah.
I think you always ask our viewers if you and I could be the baggage handlers.
Yeah.
For our next trip.
I can carry some luggage.
Absolutely. Well, Steve, thank you again for joining us. Patrick, thank you for the opportunity. Viewers, thank you for tuning in, and please join us next time as we explore another new part of this wonderful world that we live in. Until next time.